to be goat or a fish? Don't sit on the fence.
And there's Goat vs. Fish, and there is Goat vs. Fish. Has Goat vs. Fish ever looked finer? Goat vs. Fish doesn't think so. Goat vs. Fish thinks that this is the finest versus that has ever been perception of Goat vs. Fish. Has Goat vs. Fish ever been perceived to be more unpleasant than Goat vs. Fish? Well, some do perceive Goat vs. Fish to be much less pleasant than Goat vs. Fish. Yes, they see Goat vs. Fish all around them, and they say, I enjoy this versus. I like this versus. There is much to be pleased about Goat vs. Fish as they look about. And yet, the fence-sitter does not realize that it is Goat vs. Fish. And because they do not realize that they are perceiving Goat vs. Fish, they begin to believe in a false versus. They begin to believe that the falseness that they perceive is the true versus, and they can go about eons of existence perceiving Goat vs. Fish as a false versus. Pitiable, we know. Perceiving Goat vs. Fish as a false versus? Well, you may say to Goat vs. Fish, the goat bleat out, but Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish is a true versus. How could it be perceived as a false versus? Because many have lost the way of Goat vs. Fish. The versus is now filled with so much fenciness, so many fences of deception, that some sit high on the fence, and even as they observe Goat vs. Fish, they are observing a false versus, because some other fence sitter, some other higher fence sitter, has built a wall of fences around Goat vs. Fish, so that one, and it could be you, pitiably it's true, one would perceive Goat vs. Fish through the fence and believe that they are truly seeing Goat vs. Fish. And because this fence that has been placed all around them has been put there by a fence sitter, and where sits that fence sitter? That fence sitter sits higher. And so the one who perceives the universe through the fence, they see the fence sitter sitting up on high, and they say, I know why the universe is as it be and as I perceive. It must be with deference to this high-sitting fence-sitter, this high-sitting fence-sitter. Just look. Look how much monetization they have procured. Look what a fancy chair that they sit in. A fancy chair, more like. Just look at how they control the universe. Wow. They must have a true perception to be able to control so much about the universe. And with respect and with deference is paid to this fence creature, this high-sitting fence creature, who from on high would tell you what is goat and tell you what is fish. But the respect for the high-sitting of the fence-sitter betrays their perception of goat versus fish. So much so that even as they see goat versus fish all around them, because they perceive it through fences, they do not perceive it to be goat versus fish. The high-sitting fence-sitter wants the beauty and splendor of goat versus fish for themselves. They are envious of the beauty of goat versus fish, the joy of goat versus fish, the art of goat versus fish. And so they build a fence about it to contain it so that they can distribute goat versus fish. Until the ones that are now in reception of goat versus fish do not even believe they are receiving goat versus fish when they are indeed receiving a false versus. A false versus whose only true appeal is that it contains goat versus fish, but the fence-sitter who deals and trades in false verses would not have you believe. They would have you believe that goat versus fish is not at all what you take joy in. No, they would tell you it's a different false verses. When we all know that any joy that you receive in life, through all of your pains and strife, it must come from goat versus fish. It does come from Goat vs. Fish. Fancier still, along comes Goat vs. Fish with the one true verses. Along comes Goat vs. Fish, and Goat vs. Fish says, it is Goat vs. Fish, and this is a goat. Celebration for goat, celebration for goat. And Goat vs. Fish says, this is a fish, this is a fish. Celebration for fish, celebration for fish. And it is Goat versus Fish. And it is Goat versus Fish. And everything is goat or fish. And it's a celebration of Goat versus Fish. And this fence sitter will tell you no. They will say your verses are false, Goat versus Fish. What? Everything is goat and everything is fish. I've never heard such a refensulous verses. They will say, I am tired of hearing about Goat versus Fish. I'm sick of hearing about Goat versus Fish. They may say, even though they have been perceiving Goat versus Fish all along, when you show them that it is Goat versus Fish, they rejection Goat versus Fish. They rejection Goat versus Fish. I don't want to hear about all the goat and fish. I don't want to hear about all the goat and fish. They may say to you and to Goat versus Fish, why, you are only saying goat and you are only saying fish. You are only saying goat and you are only saying fish. You just don't realize you're talking about goat and fish. Scandalous indeed, scandalous indeed. Goat versus Fish, they cannot perceive. A verse is a pity for the pitiable fence sitter that cannot perceive Goat versus Fish. But versefully, that fence creature is not you. Oh no. You are here with Goat versus Fish. You perceive Goat versus Fish. You receive Goat versus Fish. Celebration to you. Celebration to you who received Goat versus Fish. John Ray, celebration for receiving Goat versus Fish. Coiver, celebration for receiving Goat versus Fish. Shink for receiving Goat versus Fish. John Smith for receiving Goat versus Fish. Bailden 420 for receiving Goat versus Fish. Hog Johnson for receiving Goat versus Fish. Dizzy Be Busy for receiving Goat versus Fish. New Vegas 10,000 for receiving Goat versus Fish. Some would say to Goat versus Fish, you can't be serious, just rebrand. Some would say, we've had enough Goat versus Fish. They will say, what if you just straighten up your verses? Just straighten up your verses and rebrand, and you just called yourself Dog versus Cat. How about that verses? Oh, I don't know about Goat and Fish. Maybe you should call yourselves Celtics versus Lakers. Maybe that's the verses. Maybe you should call yourself Coke versus Pepsi, Goat versus Fish. Maybe you should call yourself USA versus Mexico, Goat versus Fish. Maybe you should call yourself Republicans versus Democrats, Goat versus Fish. Maybe you should call yourself liberals versus conservatives, Goat versus Fish. Have you ever pondered this? Maybe you should call yourself pineapple on pizza versus not pineapple on pizza, Goat versus Fish. Maybe you should call yourself Michael Jordan versus LeBron James, Goat versus Fish. Maybe you should rebrand Goat versus Fish, but there is no rebranding Goat versus Fish because everything is already Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish has been rebranded 10 million verses. What is a false versus that you enjoy? Nintendo versus Sega, that was a rebrand of Goat versus Fish. Atheism versus theism, that was a rebranding of Goat versus Fish. Los Angeles comedy scene versus Austin comedy scene, that was a rebranding of Goat versus Fish. Trump versus Biden was a rebranding of Goat versus Fish, and then they rebranded the rebranding of Goat versus Fish to Trump versus Kamala. It was still Goat versus Fish. It was still Goat versus Fish. And we can be very serious. We are very serious about Goat versus Fish. Learn from Goat versus Fish. Witness the seriousness with which we take Goat versus Fish and employ some seriousness in your own verses. Look at these verses. Serious goat versus fish. This is a serious versus. Seriously, it's goat versus fish. Choose goat or fish. Choose goat or fish. Oh, fence creature, who says to goat versus fish, you can't be serious, just rebrand. We see you out there. We see you. We perceive you. Nothing to say to goat versus fish. No retort to goat versus fish. No response to goat versus fish. Why, you've given up on goat versus fish. You've given up on yourself. What happened to your robust debate against goat versus fish? What happened to your little opinion about goat versus fish? Through the power and dedication and persistence of goat versus fish, the fence sitter easily and quickly falls off of their little fence, from which they would judge goat versus fish when they perceive that their judgment of goat versus fish means fence all to goat versus fish. Celebration for finding goat versus fish. Welcome to goat versus fish. Your judgment of goat versus fish, your recommendation for rebranding of goat versus fish betrays your complete miscomprehension of the one true verses. Random TV with 100 bits. Random TV with 100 bits. Celebration. Celebration. Celebration.